Good morning, church.
Good morning.
It's good to be here this morning. I know I don't get to come down quite as often as I used to. All right, guys, duck and run. No, it's good. It's good to be able to be here. I was sort of just impromptu invited, which is great. And I said, yeah, sure, I can come. And I had absolutely nothing to say. But I found something. It's not quite as profound as some of the sermons that I have delivered here. It's not something where I found something not new, but something that reorganizes the way we look at a major part of our worship or our scripture. But I found a little something that I'd like to share. Don't advance the slides quite yet. We'll just leave it here for now. If you would turn to Hebrews chapter 11. I'm glad we've sung this morning a lot about relying on God and about God's spiritual power and faith, because this morning we're going to talk about the story of a very, very faith-filled man, someone who believed he could accomplish anything. In Hebrews chapter 11, in verse 32, there's a short list of the leftovers, sort of, after they've talked about all these heroes of faith, and it says, "And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens." Did any of those names stand out to you? There are actually quite a few of them that stand out to me. Jephthah stands out. He's not someone that they talk about a whole lot. So is Barak. He's not even supposedly named among the judges. You know, when we learn the judges as we're kids or whatever, we list the 15 judges. We didn't even talk about Barak because he was kind of a wuss. We give the title to Deborah instead. But one of the names that stands out to me in there is Samson. Would you say Samson is a positive or negative example? It's really tough, right? Was Samson a good or a bad dude? He's mentioned here as having great faith. Yet when we think about Samson, what is the first story that pops into your head? Samson and Delilah. Samson and Delilah. There are, I was about to say there are songs written about it. That's just a parody. Every time I hear "Hey There, Delilah," it's just completely ruined for me. Samson and Delilah is that classic fated love story. It's like, it's very Shakespearean. It's a tragedy, almost like Romeo and Juliet. But we're going to look at Samson's life, and we're not even going to hardly cover Samson and Delilah. I've titled this sermon, actually, Samson Before Delilah. We've studied on and off the individual stories in here, but I want to go through Samson's life in chronological order, read some of the verses, talk about what happened, what sort of cards he was dealt, how he dealt with them, and say some things about the way that he acted throughout the story. We're going to end up talking about three things: his motivation and how it changed over time and morphed, about the vow that he had to take, because, who here is an expert on the Nazirite vow? Yeah. And we're going to talk about the way that God helped him. But first we'll start in Judges chapter 13. I'm not actually going to read any verses from that chapter, but I want you to know where these things are so you can sort of follow along and so that you can do any study on your own afterward, because there's a lot to Samson and we're not going to cover quite everything. Judges chapter 13 the entire chapter is an angel coming and announcing the birth of Samson. That doesn't happen that often. Samuel's birth was announced. Jesus' birth was announced. John the Baptist had his birth announced. You think of any others? I can't, right off the top of my head, I can't think of any others. There was a couple who were barren, as most of these people who were going to have children were barren for one reason or another, be it because they're a virgin or because they just had no children. They were barren. They prayed to the Lord for a child. An angel of the Lord comes and tells them, there's this special child who's going to come. He's going to be the deliverer of Israel. And I want you to, during your pregnancy, follow the rules of the Nazirite vow. And the child will grow up as a Nazirite. And the parents reacted both in fear and in awe and astonishment, but we're not talking about the parents today. That's Judges chapter 13. And the chapter ends with the verse that says, two verses that say, the woman bore a son and called his name Samson, and the child grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to move on him at Mahaneh Dan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. So he grows up, he's full of the Spirit of the Lord, he's been blessed in his growth, and that's where we're going to start with this mighty deliverer of Israel, this God-chosen servant. And the very first thing that we read in chapter 14 there, now Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. So he went up and told his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me as a wife. And I would comment on that, but his father and mother do that well enough in verse 3, where they say, Is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren, or among all my people, that you must go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said to his father, No. Yeah, get her for me, for she pleases me well. Samson is a very stubborn person and has a very weak will around women, apparently. Very specific women, usually. So his father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, it says in verse 4, that the Lord was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. For at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. Now this is a really unique recruitment, I would say. With Gideon, the Lord comes to Gideon and says, You're going to deliver Israel. With Barak, the Lord comes and says, You're going to deliver Israel. With Ehud, I have a message from the Lord. With all these other judges, God comes and says, Let's deliver Israel. With this one, apparently this is from the Lord. God just kind of takes advantage of the fact that Samson was weak over a Philistine woman. That's strange. That's really very strange. We'll continue. We'll have more to talk about that later, but we'll continue with the story. In verses 5 and 6, it says, He went down to Timnah with his father and mother and came to the vineyards of Timnah. Now, to his surprise, a young lion came roaring against him. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he tore the lion apart as one would have torn apart a young goat, though he had nothing in his hand. But he did not tell his father or mother what he had done. Now, another thing to keep in mind, again, we're going to come back to this later, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. It's not something you should just kind of overshadow and think, oh, well, yeah, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him. This was a miracle. Samson wasn't just some strong dude. This was a miracle that happened on the way to meet this, to go back and forth between this woman of Timnah who was not an Israelite. So anyway, we continue on with the story. I'm not going to read all these verses. Samson meets with a woman. He prepares to marry her. On the way to the wedding feast, he sees what has become of the lion. This carcass of the lion, these bees have come and made a nest in it and created honey. He eats some of the honey. He brings it to his family and he gives them some of the honey. And he goes to this feast. During the feast, I'm sure he was enjoying himself immensely. He's got all these bachelors, I guess. It's a big bachelor party. All these bachelors from Philistia, from the Philistines, around him. And he makes a wager for them for 30 garments. And he tells them a riddle. And the riddle is, if you can recall it, out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet. He makes a riddle of this lion that he is bemused by. And for days, they can't solve this riddle. So they go to his wife that he's just married. He's been married less than a week at this point. They go to his wife after the feast, and they get her to kind of backstab him and tell them the answer to the riddle. They get her to just beseech him and get the riddle out of him. She passes the answer on to them. They answer him, and he gets a little upset about that because these people have turned his wife against him. And so he does get them their garments that he promised them, the 30 garments, by going and killing 30 Philistines, taking their garments, and giving them to the people. Then he gets mad and goes home and leaves his wife. He was very not happy about this riddle, which it wasn't a very fair riddle. Let's be honest here. It was not a very fair riddle, and they shouldn't have been able to solve it, but he gets upset that his wife has betrayed him like that, and he needs to go stomp off and just kind of relieve his anger. And while he was gone, his wife was given away to someone who was one of the cohorts, one of the best men at the wedding, one of the groomsmen, because well, I don't know exactly why he did it. They give an excuse as to why, but that was not a good idea. Let's just say that. So he's angry. He leaves. The wife is given to the best man. They're like, oh, I guess we'll never see Samson again. That was a one-note thing. Let's hope we don't see him again. He just killed 30 men. But he comes back in Judges chapter 15. It says, after a while, in the time of wheat harvest, it happened that Samson visited his wife with a young goat. And he said, let me go into my wife into her room. But her father would not permit him to go in. Her father said, I really thought that you thoroughly hated her. Therefore I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister better than she? Please, take her instead. Okay. And Judges is a weird book, guys. And Samson said to them, this time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines if I harm them. Then Samson went and caught 300 foxes. It doesn't say the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, but really now? He caught 300 foxes without the Spirit of the Lord? I'm thinking it's implied here. Caught 300 foxes, and he took torches, turned the foxes tail to tail, and put a torch between each pair of tails. When he had set the torches on fire, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and burned up both the shocks and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and olive groves. That's a really funny image, honestly. I want to take the story seriously, but this is a very funny image. This very angry man taking these foxes and lashing their tails together and putting torches on them. It's just really, this is a very outlandish story, even for what you find in the Bible. These aren't fully, these aren't ridiculous like some of the miracles that you see that Jesus did. He's not raising the dead or anything like that. He's just catching 30 foxes or 300 foxes and lashing their tails together. It's really strange. Well, the Philistines are not happy that Samson has burned all of their crops. And so they escalate things. They go and they take his father-in-law and wife, that's not really his wife anymore, and burn them to death. And Samson isn't happy about that either. So this is back and forth going, right? Samson, he kills 30 Philistines, takes their garments, and so they give his wife away. And so then he burns their fields, and so they burn his wife and father-in-law. And so Samson gets irritated, and he says something very interesting to me regarding his motive in chapter 15 and verse 7. Samson said to them, since you would do a thing like this, I will surely take revenge on you. And after that, I will cease. Will he cease? Will he really? After that, I will cease. I kind of want to take him at his word for this because he's been kind of measured out with this, at least with the burning of crops. He's kind of almost being reasonable here. It's like, well, this calls for something more than just burning your grain. You literally killed those people. So he goes and attacks them hip and thigh with a great slaughter. We're not given numbers on this, I don't think. In Judges 15 and verse 8, he attacks them hip and thigh with a great slaughter, and he says, okay, I've taken revenge, our accounts are settled, everything's good. And he goes and he hangs out in a city in Judah. The Philistines don't think everything is good. And so they come after Samson. And in verse 11 of Judges chapter 15, the story continues. 3,000 men of Judah. You see, the Philistines go in camp against Judah, like a war camp, coming to arrest Samson, but they come as an army. It says, then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, do you not know that the Philistines rule over us? What is this you have done to us? And he said to them, as they did to me, so I have done to them. But they said to him, we have come down to arrest you, that we may deliver you into the hands of the Philistines. Now, if you follow Samson's character so far in this story, what do you think his response is going to be to this? I don't think so. I imagine Samson jumping up and being like, well, as you have done to me, so I'm also going to do to you. And just starts attacking them hip and thigh with a great slaughter. These are his people. And they're being put into a certain position. You notice that the first thing they say there is, do you not know that the Philistines rule over us? They're reminding him, we don't have a choice. We're all being oppressed just like you have been. Now, granted, Samson's oppression is a little bit of his own doing. But we're all being oppressed just as you are. And so Samson in verse 12 says, swear to me that you will not kill me yourselves. So they spoke to him saying, no, but we will tie you securely and deliver you into their hand, but we will surely not kill you. And they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. Now we know how this goes. Samson's not very good at being bound. He rips off the ropes as soon as the Philistines come at him, picks up the donkey's jawbone, and this is where he kills 1,000 men with a donkey's jawbone. And immediately after that, it says in verse 18, he became very thirsty, which I imagine you could work up a thirst killing 1,000 men with a donkey's jawbone. And he cried out to the Lord and said, "You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" So God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, and water came out, and he drank, and his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore he called the place En Hakor, which is in Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. There are only really two stories that happen after this point. One is when he goes into a harlot after these 20 years. It's a kind of just standalone story. He goes into a harlot, and the Philistines come in and camp against him, as they tend to do. And rather than just hide overnight, he picks up the city gates, carries them off the top of a hill, and escapes. And then after that, you have the story of Samson and Delilah, him falling in love with her, the Philistines trying to figure out the secret to his strength, him lying to her several times, finally confessing his secret, getting his hair cut. We'll reference that, but I don't need to go over that story again. You know the story of Samson and Delilah. And his final act, after he's been blinded and put into the temple of the Philistine gods, where he kills many of the Philistines by taking down the whole temple on his own head. Did you notice anything different about this story when we put it all in order like that? Did anything jump out at you at all? There are a few things that jumped out to me. So we're going to talk about those things. You have the motive. Samson's motive changes a lot throughout this story. It's really interesting. It starts out, obviously, with revenge, right? It starts with revenge. We talked about this back and forth that he had. The people cheated on the riddle, and so he killed some of them. And so they took his wife, and so he burned their crops. And so they burned his wife, and so he killed a bunch of them. It's kind of going back and forth. But that point where he says, "After this, I will cease," it's almost like he's getting weary of it, you know. But he goes and he takes revenge anyway because he is angry. And then he says, "After that, I will cease." Once that happens, the children of Judah come and they try to arrest him. And it's that point where it feels like things change. When they say, "The Philistines are lording over us. The Philistines are above us. We have no choice." When Samson goes out, now these Philistines that came to arrest him, they haven't done anything to him. They haven't killed his wife. They haven't cheated at his riddles. They haven't taken his wife away from him. There's nothing else they can do to him except try to kill him. They haven't done anything. And yet he still attacks them with a great slaughter. And then immediately afterwards, he judges the children of Israel, meaning he was a military leader, a deliverer for all of those years. What changed in the way I look at it, what changed is that when he went out and attacked them with the donkey's jawbone, he was no more fighting for himself. Yes, they came to arrest him. Yes, he could have taken that as an affront. But he says nothing about revenge throughout all of this. This army has gone and encamped against Judah. If David was in a city, and the Israelites and the Philistines came and camped against it, and surrounded the city, and besieged it, and said, "Bring out David, and you'll survive," and David comes out and attacks and kills 1,000 of them, we wouldn't have said, "Whoa, man, David getting revenge on those people for coming to arrest him." David would have been protecting his people. That's actually kind of a filter that I've been looking at this story through. If we look at this story through the David filter, Samson seems like a whole lot nicer a guy. Yeah. Samson comes out and he protects the city by driving them away, killing 1,000 of them with a donkey's jawbone, and then calls out to the Lord for help, and the Lord brings him water. Now, granted, later on, he makes his mistakes. He goes into a harlot. He falls to Delilah. And it is during that time with Delilah that he really turns his back on God by consciously and on purpose revealing the secret of his strength, revealing the details of his vow, and thus breaking the last bit of his vow to God that he had, consciously turning away from God. And that led to his downfall until that final moment of both revenge and justice toward the Philistines. But it's very interesting to me that he judged Israel for 20 years. Do you ever think about that? That one verse, it just says, Samson judged Israel for 20 years. He was a military leader to them. He was a champion. He was doing this for the people. If it was just some lone wolf going and taking revenge against the Philistines and just fighting them in the camps, he wouldn't have been a judge of Israel. He would have been some crazy serial killing Israelite. But he was a judge, which means he went to war against them, probably with other forces with them. And that he stood as a barrier between Judah and Philistia. Things changed. He was no longer taking just revenge for himself. But then there's that last moment, and we're going to turn there, even though we didn't read this part of the story. When Samson dies with the Philistines, in chapter 16, in verse 28, when he calls to the Lord, he says, O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Then Samson said, let me die with the Philistines in the next verse. And he brought it down on their heads. Is he back to vengeance now? Is he back to revenge? Is he doing what the Lord wants him to? Yes. Yes, he is. He's doing what he should have been doing instead of falling for Delilah. Is he taking revenge for his 2 eyes? Yes. Yes, he is. Not only was he doing this for God, but also his motive was personal at the same time. Is that okay? Yeah, it is okay. Now, granted, it didn't turn out that well because that personal motive wavered every time a woman crossed his path. It wasn't as strong as him having the motive just purely out of devotion to God. But what I wrote here, God's battle was personal to Samson. But interestingly enough, if you go back to the very beginning where it says that it was of the Lord that Samson went and fell in love with this woman of Timnah, you could say the same thing in reverse. Samson's battle, Samson's revenge, was personal to God. Because God cared that it was happening. God had his own, I don't want to say it like it's a casual thing, God had his own beef with the Philistines. God had his own plans that this was following. In our war against Satan, is it ever personal?
Yes.
I think it's sometimes, it doesn't have to be, but maybe it should be in some cases. Do we resent Satan? Do we resent the forces of this world, the prince of the power of the air? Do we resent him when he drags people away? When he causes strife in the church? When we see these problems, when problems come up between brethren, when people that are just so ingrained in the world, when we try to reach them and they just fall back away immediately or just can't hear us, when Satan plucks that word away, do we resent them or do we resent Satan behind it? Sometimes we need to take it personally, but not personally from that brethren, not personally from that person who's been blinded to the world. We need to look at Satan and, as Samson did, see an enemy, see a foe, see someone that not only does God want punished, but that we have a personal desire to work against. We don't all have to make it personal. Not every prophet of God, I think, did, but Samson made it personal, and that was okay, I think. Let's talk about Samson's vow a little bit. Nazirite vow. Who here knows, I know this is a sermon, but we can open up as a class discussion almost. Who here knows what all was prohibited by, it's in number 6 if you want to cheat, by the Nazirite vow? No dead body, no wine. Couldn't cut your hair. Is there anything else? I think there's something else. Okay. You cannot eat anything unclean ever. Now that's Jews always couldn't do unclean. That was not allowed in general. But they were to cleanse themselves. The Nazirite had special methods used to cleanse themselves from that because they were absolutely 100% not supposed to do that. If the children of Israel, you ate something unclean, okay, or took of something unclean, do this ceremonial washing. It's not necessarily a sin. We just want to make sure you're clean and everything. Nazirite couldn't do it at all. How long was the Nazirite vow? Sometimes short. It was often temporary, usually temporary. Being a Nazirite from birth was not very normal. So we have no wine and no grapes even, like no raisins, nothing from the vine. No razor to your head, nothing unclean, and no going near a dead body at all, period. No dead body at all. No animal dead body, nothing. It says you can't even go to your brother or mother's funeral, okay? Period. You can't do any of that stuff. No going near a dead body. How well did Samson hold up on this front?
No.
Would you say that he had wine at some point? I don't remember whether it's explicitly stated, but he did quite a few feasting things. Yeah, there's a very good chance of it. Well, he let a razor touch his head, obviously, at the time with Delilah. Nothing unclean. Would you call honey made in a lion's carcass clean? No? There's also the dead body thing. Not only did he have, there was the lion's dead body, and he went and he ate something out of it. That's definitely going near a dead body. He also made a lot of dead bodies.
And the jawbone.
Yeah, and the jawbone of the donkey, that was part of a dead body. But, there was 1,000 more dead bodies pretty soon, and he was pretty close to all of them. He was not a very good Nazirite. But it's interesting. Samson broke all of these, one after another. He actually made his family eat something unclean without telling them, which is very interesting. He broke all of these one after another. Why was it that his strength only broke? Why was it his strength only broke when he got his hair cut? Why didn't it break when he ate something out of the lion? Why didn't it break when he drank some wine, possibly? Why didn't it break when he went near things that are unclean? Yeah.
Because when he cut his hair, that's when he broke all of them.
That's a possibility. I don't actually have an answer to this entirely. I have a couple of theories. That's one of them. At that point, he had fully forsaken the Nazirite vow. The unclean stuff, you could actually keep the Nazirite vow after that. You just had several ceremonial washings and things you had to go to. You had to go to a priest and affirm that you're still keeping the vow. You could fix all of that. And I think the wine was sort of included in the uncleanness. You could fix all of that. You can't fix your hair once you cut it off. You ever been to a hairdresser and you get your hair cut and you're like, oh, it's too short. And they can't put it back. You can get hair extensions these days, I suppose. But they're like, oh, how is that? And I'm like, I didn't want it this short. You don't tell them that, though, because there's not really any point, except to make them feel bad about the haircutting job that they've done. You can't put that hair back. When he told Delilah, and I guess it's partly that, partly what Forrest said, and partly when he cut his hair, he was turning his back completely on that vow that he made, or that his parents made for him, that he kept from birth. Turning his back completely on that. Does that remind you of anything? I know some of you probably weren't there, but I delivered a sermon probably 3 or 4 years ago, maybe 4 or 5. I don't know how long I've been preaching, actually. Years and years ago, I preached a sermon that said the line between being saved and lost is when you intentionally turn your back on God. When you take God out of that priority of your life, shift him to the side and say, I'm going to do this instead. That's that point where you are just, and the Bible says as well in several different ways, that loving God first is the greatest commandment, and that the unpardonable sin is to know, one of the sins, there remains no forgiveness for those who know what is right to do and then intentionally go off and sin again. In this case, Samson knew what the secret to his hair was. That's why he was lying all those times. He knew what the secret to his power was, what the secret to his bond with God was, and he forsook that entirely. When he told her that, he knew what was going to happen. Did he not? Do we think Samson was stupid enough to think, every time I've told her something, she's tried it? Is she going to cut my hair if I tell her? Yeah. He intentionally forsook that. He said, and in doing that, he forsook his entire role as deliverer of Israel. He said, you know what? Forget my strength. I love this woman. I care about this woman. It's a very dumb decision, in my opinion. I care about this woman more than any of this. I'm wearied by her asking me. I'm choosing her and staying with her over my strength, over my role as deliverer. Forget Israel, Delilah. At that point, he lost it. It's interesting when you look at his vow that it's not the incidental things that he did along the way that caused problems between him and God. Even when he went into that harlot in a moment of weakness, what I'm assuming was a moment of weakness, because it's specific enough to point it out. I don't think he was going into harlots all the time. The Spirit of the Lord was still with him. He was not in himself strong enough to lift city gates onto his back and walk up a hill. People don't do that. The Spirit of the Lord stayed with him until he intentionally forsook God by breaking the vow in a way that he could not fix. faith always trumps those incidental little things. In Hebrews 11 and verse 6, I'm not necessarily going to turn all the way there. It says, without faith, it is impossible to please him. We're about to talk about faith. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. And in Psalm 51, it says, when David's lamenting over his sin with Bathsheba, he says, you do not desire burnt offerings and sacrifices, but a contrite heart. These sacrifices, these incidental keepings of the vow, these little problems. I don't want to say little problems because Samson had a lot of weaknesses. But these individual sins that he did not matter as much as him turning his back entirely on God as he did with Delilah. Lastly, I want to talk about Samson's faith and the Spirit of the Lord that came upon him. If you look back at the verses throughout the story, when he fought the lion, it said the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. When he killed 30 Philistines to pay the wager with their clothing, it says the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. When he killed 1,000 with a donkey's jawbone, it said the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. It did not say the Spirit of the Lord came upon him when he attacked Hip and Thigh with a great slaughter or when he caught all the foxes. But again, he had the Spirit of the Lord on him when those things happened. I refuse to believe that he was just determined enough to grab 150 foxes and lash all their tails together. I couldn't do that. So let me ask you a question. Have you seen a picture, an artist depiction of Samson? An artist depiction of Samson? Yeah, it looked like this, right? He was super ripped, super muscular. Looks like one of those bodybuilders that you see on TV. They're doing these heavy lifting contests. I've seen one where this guy has these muscles bulging out everywhere and lifting this giant boulder. It looks kind of nasty, honestly. Is that what Samson looked like? Was it his strength that he was beating all these people with? I can't think of a man alive who could do that. It was the Spirit of the Lord coming upon him, just as the Spirit of the Lord came on Elijah when he ran ahead of Ahab's chariot on the way to a city. I don't think Elijah just had super good running shoes and muscular calves. He was brought on by the Lord in the same way that Samson was. I don't think Samson looked any more muscular than any other Israelite. If he did, why would the Philistines be asking, what's the deal with this guy? Where does he get his strength? It's my six-pack, clearly. Now, Samson was just a normal guy who was given strength by the Lord. Could you imagine being a normal, somewhat fit? This is not the modern age. He didn't have a smartphone that he was sitting on all day. A somewhat fit Israelite going up against 1,000 men. Going up against a lion. Going up against however many would be a great slaughter. Going up against an entire army encamped outside of a city and lifting the gates and just leaving. Attacking 30 Philistines would be crazy enough. We think of those things as being acts of revenge often, or acts of the crazy man that was Samson, and both of those things are kind of true. How much faith do we usually see in those actions? When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fiery furnace, we think, oh, that's faith. They faced that. They knew they were going to die. How is that any different from what Samson did? You go out and you face 1,000 people. You're bound. Okay, you have no weapons. You've got over 1,000 probably, because they encamped against the city. Over 1,000 people. The children of Israel are turning you over. You're unarmed. You're bound. I'd probably take my chances with a fiery furnace, honestly. At least that way, they're not going to grab me and torture me and stab me and all that kind of stuff. I'll be incinerated super quick, like the people who threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the furnace. I'd rather not face that fate. Samson says, okay, take me out there, put me out there. The Lord will be with me. He did not say that. But if he didn't think it, he wouldn't have been able to do it. He went out there, he took a donkey's jawbone and killed 1,000 people. When a lion came up against him, he didn't run away. He tore it in pieces. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him. How do we not take... I've had people talk to me, how is Samson in the Hall of Fame of Faith? Look at all the bad things he did. How could he not be? Look at all of these crazy things that he did. Samson's faith in these instances far outweighs something like David and Goliath. That was a one-on-one battle. That's practically fair. Jonathan and his armor bearer going up and fighting the army, they had a whole army behind them that was going to come up after them. And they didn't kill 1,000 people. Gideon and his 300 men, he had backup. He had 300 men against the sands of the seashore, but he had backup. Samson didn't. Samson was a one-man army because of his strength, because of his faith. That's crazy. It kind of just brings to mind how we should remember things. You know, have you ever looked back on a day that you tried to remember, right? You look back on a day where something really bad happened. What do you remember about that day? The really bad thing that happened, obviously. You don't remember any of the good things that happened. What did you eat that day? Was it good? How did you live that day? Did you help out somebody at some point? Did you accomplish some neat project? Did you hear a nice compliment for somebody or smile because you saw the smile on a child's face or something? No, you remember the bad thing that happened. When it comes to Samson, we remember, well, he was weak with women. He was strong. He was really angry. He got a lot of vengeance going on. And we don't remember all of the good things about Samson. We don't remember his mighty faith. We don't remember his judging Israel for 20 years. That's pretty easy to overlook, isn't it? 20 years of faithful judging of Israel. Maybe we should remember people for their faith a little more often. I have fallen ill to this a few times, thinking of someone who is a part of the church and thinking of them in terms of that hypocritical thing that they believe, or this particular belief that they espouse too often, or this problem, this issue that I have with them. And they might preach an entire sermon, and they'll say one line that I disagree with, and that one line is the takeaway I have from the sermon. Maybe we should remember people for the good things, for the faith that they have, and stop expecting people to be perfect. Samson was a very, very flawed man. He was one of the most flawed judges in the entire book, outside of maybe Abimelech, because he was self-appointed. Samson was not what you would call a good person. Neither was David, really, in a lot of cases. And we think of him for his good actions because there are just more of them in there. Because we don't get David served Israel faithfully for 20 years as a single verse, and then all of his bad stuff aside. We need to work on seeing the good in people a little better, just as we can do with Samson. Now, I don't have anything profound to say about Samson, other than following through his life, his motives, the way that he acted, the way that he kept or did not keep his vow, the great faith that he had. All this is kind of just food for thought, going through this character study. Samson's rocky life perfectly shows the flawed man's relationship with God, and it kind of gives us hope that we can overcome our flaws. Not entirely by beating them ourselves. Samson never really beat his flaws, but he had faith enough to make up for it. I'm not saying that, works are not important. I'm not saying that we shouldn't try. Samson did pretty well for 20 years, apparently. But even Paul, all these biblical figures have bad times. Even Paul in Romans 7, not verse 19, says, "That which I will not to do, I do." That sin that was within me, you know that passage? He wasn't saying, well, I really want to sin, but I don't because Jesus helps me. He said, that which I will not to do, that I find myself doing. Paul continued to sin. Paul continued to fall to whatever particular issue that he had. We don't know what issue he had exactly, because he's not quite as detailed about that as Samson was. But Paul continued to fall over and over again. He didn't conquer that by just getting better. He didn't conquer that through his own strength. He conquered it through Jesus, through his repentance, and through always standing up to try again. Samson, to sum things up, Samson fought for God, but he fought for personal reasons as well. It's his decision to forsake God, to forsake that vow entirely that brought him low. But his faith was actually scary. Can you imagine an entire church full of people who had faith the same as Samson?
Wow.
It would actually be terrifying. They wouldn't necessarily all be good people. They would rely on God a lot. I think I would rather have a church full of Samsons than a church full of people that have been raised to be good people, and so they follow all of the rules, but don't have the faith in God to stand up to the world. I would rather have a church of Samsons. How would you like it to be said that your faith is actually scary? There are only a few people I've ever met in my life that I would consider their faith to actually be scary, to where if I was a non-believer getting into a conversation with them, I would either have to open my mind and consider the things that they said or run away. because they are just so, they believe. They believe really, really hard. They believe with their entire heart and soul and mind and strength. And they love God with all of that. And they just believe so hard. When we go out into the world and we see people and we don't have the perspective that sees them as lost souls and we don't have the perspective of eternity, I almost call into question whether we even believe all the time. People like Samson may not have believed all the time, actually, as well. But when he had faith, he had faith. I'd like to have brothers in Christ who can't be stopped by 1,000 men. And God alone can give us that strength. That's all I have to say about Samson. I don't know if we're having an invitation song or anything like that immediately. But if you want to bolster your faith, or if you have any issues in your life that you'd like to talk about, or if, I think everybody here is already a Christian, basically. If you need any help from the church, we're here to bolster each other and strengthen each other. Samson didn't need it, but we sure do. Maybe if Samson had a group of people around him, he could have mitigated the whole flaw thing that was going on. But let's just try to resolve to have faith like Samson.